Hi, my name's Scott Thornbury. I'm a teacher, teacher educator. I'm not a researcher or an applied linguist in any kind of academic sense. But what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about the relation between theory and practice, and particularly in relation to my own development as a teacher and as a teacher educator. And first of all, it's worth pointing out, I think, that all teachers have theories of learning and of teaching from day one of their career. They may not be explicit in the sense that they can put words to it, but you come to teaching with some kind of excess baggage, as it were, theoretically. You have views, whether you can articulate them or not, as to how people learn and how people learn languages and second languages. Where do these theories come from? Well, they come from a variety of sources. Principally, perhaps, for your own second language learning experience, whether at school, university, or in the wild, on a trip to Mexico or whatever, where you picked up some rudimentary Spanish. And this is going to impact very much on your personal theory of teaching and learning. Folk theories, those are the theories that are out there in the wider world, the non-expert, if you like, theories of language learning. And we'll look at some of those in a second. And of course, your initial training, if you've had any, will impact upon your what's sometimes called your personal practical theory of second language teaching. And of course, this is all going to be filtered through your own personal values and beliefs, irrespective of whether they relate specifically to language teaching. Let's look at the folk theory aspect of this. And of course, we're all familiar with these kinds of advertisements for language courses, both in print and online, which make very dodgy, let's say, claims about how languages are learned. I'm not going to go into these in any detail, but there's very much a view out there that second languages are learned more or less how it is supposed that you learnt your first language, that you listened, you repeated, and you understood in some kind of magical way. And the same principles then are applied to these courses for second language learning. And these kinds of principles have been popularized more recently through the massive increase in the number of self-styled polyglots or hyperpolyglots. There are many of them out there. You'll be familiar, no doubt. You may well have used some of their techniques and methods. Benny Lewis, Gabriel Weiner, Paul Pimsleur runs a whole industry dedicated to teaching second languages based on principles that tend to have been homegrown. Their particular experience of learning the second language. Nothing wrong with that, but of course it's just one person's experience of learning a second language. To what extent can you generalize it is debatable. If you look at all these different self-styled polyglots, you'll find that probably there's only one thing that they have in common, and that is that they all devoted a lot of time to the enterprise of learning the various languages that they know. That's about it. But they all did it in lots of different ways. So we need to be a little bit skeptical about some of their claims. So what I'm saying is that we start off with a kind of underdeveloped and probably unarticulated theory, the implicit theory that we come into teaching with, and over time this becomes articulated. We can put it into words. We can justify what we're doing in the classroom by some kind of notions, which may well come from our reading, our further training, and further experiences as second language learners. And then hopefully these informed theories become not rigid, but able to adapt. And we'll see, I want to look at that in more detail in a second. Now, how does an implicit theory become an articulated theory? One way of that it does this is through what's sometimes called the reflective cycle. When something happens, it causes us to reflect and to think through that experience into drawing out some kind of generalization, that's theorizing, through to implementing the learning from that cycle into future teaching. And often this is triggered through some kind of concrete experience, something that happens in the classroom, and often maybe something that creates a puzzle. Something occurs in the classroom which kind of problematizes our existing implicit theory, if you like, of second language learning. Let me tell you about an example from my own experience when I first started teaching. So I was teaching in Egypt, adults, and I was working from a very structural syllabus, because that was the kinds of syllabus that existed then, very tightly controlled and very grammatical and accuracy focused. And the dominant technique was very much one of repeat and try to get it right through drilling. Yeah, so this was the methodology that I was inducted in, what I call late stage audiolingualism, and it was predicated on the view that you need to create good language habits, and you should avoid inaccuracy at all costs. So here I am, I'm teaching a lesson on the present perfect. The present perfect structure in English as in I have been to Egypt. And I had this kind of neat idea. So I have this situation where I've got a tour guide and a foreigner in Egypt. Yeah? And the tour guide is trying to plan some activities for the foreign visitor. And so the tour guide is asking the foreign visitor about things that the foreign visitor may have experienced. Yeah? So if they've experienced that, we can cross that off the list. You've done that. Yeah? So the tour guide says questions like, have you been to the pyramids yet? And the tourist says, yes, I've already been there. And you get to think, have you been yet? Or have you done yet? Yes, I've already And that's the present perfect. So I had this going, and I was throwing out these prompts to the class, and they were meant to say, yes, I've already done that. Yeah, or I've already seen them, or I've already been there. Okay, so have you been to the pyramids yet? Fatima. And she says, yes, I've already seen them. And I was coming up with other prompts. So have you sailed on the Nile yet? Yes, I've already done that. Well, yes, I've already been there. Have you eaten falafel yet? Yes, I've already eaten it. Yeah. By this stage, I was kind of running out of prompts. So out of nowhere, I pulled this question: have you heard Kulthum yet? Now, Kulthum is a famous Egyptian singer, known throughout the Arab world, but not known by many foreigners. And so this was kind of sort of insider knowledge. So by even saying this, I was kind of situating myself as part of a culture that was common to the learners, but was surprisingly common. Yeah? And one of the learners heard this. He said, "Oh, did you hear Kulthum?" To me, surprised that I knew about this Egyptian singer. And so he said, "Did you hear Kulthum?" And I was thinking, Ahmed, whatever your name is, what are we practicing here? What are we doing? And this, I couldn't believe it, that here we were in a situation where the present perfect was maximally available, and the student didn't use it, when he should have said, have you heard Kulthum? I mean, that was my expectation then, ignoring certain contextual factors, etc. But I couldn't. I said, Ahmed, what are we practicing here? Present perfect. So, what's your question? Now, of course, for speakers of Arabic, this is problematic because the equivalent form doesn't exist of the present perfect in Arabic. And so the default form the students always go back to is the past simple. But here we were practicing the present perfect, so why was the learner not using it? So this really, for me, created a dilemma. It was a puzzle. So something's going on as if the learners were on a parallel track, in a parallel universe. There was me, very efficiently drilling the present perfect. There were the students going along. So when they were performing fine, when they knew that was what they had to do. But as soon as they stepped out of that particular situation into real meaning, real communication, then the present perfect went out the window. So I was faced with this dilemma. So what am I going to do? I reflect on it. Now, I didn't actually go and look up a book or anything at that stage. I had nobody really to ask, but I just sat on this for a while. And it was sometime later when I was I was actually at a seminar given by Peter Skian, that suddenly it started to fall into place. And Peter Skian said then, and says in his writing, teachers and learners cannot simply choose what is to be learned. To a large extent, the syllabus is built into the learner. That is to say, however much we want to impose the syllabus, the external syllabus, the syllabus in the textbook or whatever, the learners have their own built-in syllabus. They march to a beat of a different drum. And I mean, it's kind of obvious, but to me, this was like, oh, okay, this explained an awful lot retrospectively. Now, where does this view come from? Of course, it comes from research. It comes from research into developmental trajectories in learners which had been around from the 1970s or so. And this is one form of them, so that this is the proposed view of how English grammatical structures are acquired, the order in which they are acquired. The ing form, as in I'm swimming, the plural s, the copula, that is to say the verb to be in sentences like I am a teacher, the auxiliary verb, as in I am swimming, the article, then the irregular past, the irregular past, as in I went, and then the regular past, as in I liked, and so on. So this is based on a certain amount of research that was done, as we say, over 50 years ago into the famous morpheme studies. But this kind of sort of helped explain to me why learners don't seem to learn what you teach them when you teach them it. And it was, for me, where I came up, first of all, against a problem, but I was able to kind of understand the problem by reference to the research that had been done and the theories that research had generated about language learning. Notice that this research doesn't explain why this order is in the order that it is, and people are still working on that. Why do some things come earlier than others, and is it to do with frequency? Is it to do with saliency? Does some things stand out more? Is it to do with processability, etc.? Now that's a whole other question. But these are some of this is a key question that needs to be answered by the research. Why is it that learners learn things in a particular order? Here are some more key questions that have been identified, or some phenomena, if you like, that exist, that we come across in our teaching, which need to be explained by theories. So a phenomenon was when Ahmed said to me, "Did you hear Kulsum?" That was a phenomenon that kind of caused me to think and rethink. These are some of the phenomena that have been attested in the research, that exposure to input is necessary. Kind of stands to reason, but it's worth dwelling on. A good deal of second language acquisition happens incidentally. That's a fact, so we need to theorize that. Learners come to know more than what they have been exposed to in the input. And this is an interesting one. In other words, learners kind of develop knowledge that is not what was in the input. They kind of extrapolate from that knowledge in some way. How is that possible? The learner's output often follows predictable paths with predictable stages in the acquisition of a given structure. That's what I was talking about before, the so-called morpheme studies, the order of output. That second language learning is variable in its outcome. We need to explain that. Why is it that some learners do better than others? Why do some learners close in on native-like proficiency while others never get anywhere near. That second language learning is variable across linguistic subsystems, that, for example, phonology tends to lag behind and perhaps never catches up. There are limits on the effects of frequency, that however much students repeat things or hear things, it's not necessarily going to guarantee that they learn them. There are limits on the effect of the learner's first language on SLA. The first language can be a help, but it also can be a hindrance. And this is one that, this is kind of like, has implications. There are limits on the effects of instruction on SLA. However good we are as teachers and however brilliant our curriculum is and our materials, etc., there may be a limit to what we can do with those instructional processes. And finally, there are limits on the effects of output on language acquisition, that students simply speaking all the time or writing all the time doesn't guarantee that they will actually develop as language learners. These are some of the phenomena that have been attested and that we will meet as we teach. And it's nice that they've been identified for us. Issues have not necessarily been resolved, and it's still down to the individual teacher to observe these things and to think about them. And one way of thinking about them is reflecting on them using tools like this. Sorry, that was the reference there, Van Patten and Williams. Tools like this, a reflection chart. What happened to my lesson? Well, one student didn't use the present perfect when he could have done. What I learned from that learners are on a parallel track. Remaining difficulties, well, how am I going to incorporate that into my judgment of the learner's learning? I'm going to need other measures of their learning beyond their simply being able to repeat something in a drill. And feelings about the activity, I still think it's a good activity, but it's not necessarily all that the learners need to develop that particular grammatical structure. But I'm going to also have to look elsewhere to inform my theory. And this is where my theory in the head, as it develops, is very useful, but may not be enough. I need to go outside and I need to look at what other people have discovered, the experts, as it were, and put the two together. And they might not necessarily mesh. My experience of what happens in the classroom may not be the same as is represented in the literature. And that is an issue that I'm going to have to kind of think about. I'm going to reflect on this as it's going to inform my practice. And so therefore, as we say, we go from an implicit theory to an articulated theory to an informed theory, and finally, hopefully, to a theory that is adaptable, that I can adapt to different circumstances in which I'm teaching, different levels of student, different age groups of student, different first languages of students. So that is why the theory needs to be adaptive. One way of forcing that a little bit is having a task like this. Now, again, similar kind of reflective task. What do I do? What do I do generally in my teaching? Do I drill a lot? Do I correct a lot, for example? What is the meaning behind that? Why do I correct a lot? How did I come to be a teacher who corrects a lot? And how might I do things differently? This is the adaptivity kicking in. How could I teach by not correcting the students? How would I do that? How would I measure the effects of that? So that means we need to keep thinking, reflecting, but also try to keep abreast of the literature, the research that's being done. I mean, interestingly enough, I showed you that morpheme study, the crash in 1977. This is way too old to be reliable. We need to see what's happened since then in terms of these acquisition orders. What do we know now? Unfortunately, we know a lot more, or a bit more, because we have more data. We have a lot more data about learners' output. We have whole corpora of learner output that we can examine. And we also have very much more sophisticated tools for examining that data, for crunching all that data and coming up with interesting findings. So, for example, a researcher at the University of Cambridge in Great Britain looked at some of this data and applied some of these statistical tools to it to see what is there an acquisition order that we can identify across all learners. And what he found was that, wow, it's not as simple as that. It's systematic, that learners seem to go through a kind of, they're consistent in terms of the stages that they go through. but they're very individual. They're idiosyncratic. It's difficult to generalize across learners. And they're non-linear. We can't say that because this learner went from A to B, this learner's going to go from A to B, etc. And, very importantly, L1 type consistently, the first language, consistently exerted influence on accuracy. That is to say, it does matter what the learner's first language is, whereas the original Morpheme studies suggested that it doesn't matter what the learner's first language is, that the students are all going to march to the beat of the same drum in terms of their development, whether their first language is Chinese, whether it's Swahili, whether it's Portuguese or whatever. So we need to keep abreast. The research is constantly. How do we keep abreast? Well, we can't read all these research papers. We can't subscribe to all these journals. They're incredibly expensive. We may not have access to them, and they're difficult to understand. So we go to people who are able to condense the findings of this research into very user-friendly, teacher-friendly books like this one. Now it's 5th edition, or this one, or even this one. Now, with the caveat that even these writers have had to be selective in terms of where they look and what they choose to put in their books. Professor Atkinson would be the first to argue that Patsy Lightbohm and Nina Spada are coming from a particular view of language learning, and they choose their research studies accordingly. So we need to keep a little bit of distance there. What are we meant to do with this research? Do we change our teaching? Are we meant to kind of like, oh, it says here that we shouldn't correct, or it says here we should correct, or it says here we should correct like this? Do we change our teaching overnight? No, not necessarily, but we can think about it. Penny who is another practitioner rather than the researcher, who says the major function of published theories for practitioners is not that they should be put into practice, but that they should trigger reflection, act as a kind of trigger. Make me think. Reflection and critical thinking, to think critically about your own practice and about the things that your peers are telling you to do or your superiors are telling you to do. So that reflection and critical thinking is likely to result in useful learning and professional development. We're talking about professional development here, and therefore we need to look at books about professional development. Here I declare an interest. Jack Richards' 50 Tips for Teacher Development is a book I edited, and it's got lots of practical advice, including what to read, how to incorporate theory into practice, etc., how to be a reflective practitioner. So my two takeaways really from all this are these. Number one, we need to maintain a healthy skepticism. Don't believe everything that you're told about language learning, about language teaching. Remember the folk theories. No. But at the same time, we need to cultivate a ravenous curiosity. And that's sort of easily done because it's a really interesting field we're in. You know why it's interesting? Because it involves two fundamental human capacities. One is language, which all humans share, whether they're different languages or not. And the other one is learning, which all humans share. We're all learners. When you put the two things together, language and learning, you've got a very powerful combination. A combination that's going to keep you interested for the rest of your professional life. So, be curious. That's my last word on the matter. So thank you very much, and thank you, Dwight Atkinson, for giving me this opportunity to put my theory of theory on the line. And that's it from me.